And we're going to say good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. So wonderful to have, there we go, our live studio audience. Wonderful to have so many on tonight. I'm guessing it's because I managed to get the notice out early enough. We're going to start tonight with the last chapter of Masechet Megillah. Everybody say, but on the plus side, hey, because it means that we're finishing a Masechta tonight. So we're going to start with that. We're going to get it up for us on the screen over here. And apologies for any background interference, but that's the joys of half term and raising children and all the rest of it. So there we go. We may have to mute a couple of times, but hopefully we'll plod on through. Chapter 4 of Masechet Megillah, final chapter, talking about the halachas of reading the Megillah, the halachas of Kriyas HaTorah, of reading the Torah during the rest of the year. So we'll get straight into it with Mishnah Aleph. The Kriyas HaTorah, reading the Torah, must be said while standing. But when it comes to reading the Megillah, as we're going to see, Hakorei es HaMegillah omed v'yoshev. One who reads the Megillah may stand or may sit. Kra echad kra'u hashnayim yatsu. If you have one person reading, or you have two people reading in unison, says the Mishnah, yatsu, you can actually fulfill your mitzvah. Now, normally, we have a principle of not being able to distinguish when more than one person are saying something in unison. You can't really pick out the actual word or the actual individual who is saying those words. Or, for example, with the shofar, we can't have two people blowing shofar in unison because you can't really identify which shofar you're hearing the notes from. But the Mishnah over here about Kriyas HaMegillah, about reading the Megillah, says that you are able to be Yotze. You can fulfill your obligation. The reason for that is because we only read the Megillah once a year. So it's a very chaviv mitzvah. It's a very dear mitzvah. Well, it's very precious, and so people will be able to pay more attention to it. So that's an interesting start to our Mishnah this evening. Makom shenahagu levarich yavarich. If you are in a place where the minhag is to say the after blessing of the Megillah, because everybody agrees that you have to make the bracha before it, but it's not universally agreed upon that you have to say one afterwards. So if you are in a place where you say the bracha afterwards, then you should say it. V'shelo levarich, if you're in a place where they don't have the custom to say the bracha after the reading of the Megillah, then lo yivarich, then you do not say the bracha. Continuing with other Kriyas HaTorah halachot, b'sheni uv'chamishi u'b'Shabbos mincha. On a Monday morning, on a Thursday morning, or at Shabbos mincha, when we read the portion from the Torah, the first portion of the week, of that week's parasha, when we read it from the Torah, Kohen Shlosha, we give 3 call-ups. 3 people read. Now, back in the day, by the way, just a little preface over here, it used to be that people would read their own portion. So over here, we have the prevalent custom is to get a call-up, and then a Baal Koreh, a proficient reader of the law, will do the actual laning. But back in the day, everyone would actually read the piece that they were called up to. And not only that, but it seems that at least in the times of the Mishnah, there was a custom to only make a bracha at the beginning of the laning and at the end of the laning. So we're familiar that a person gets called up and they say a bracha before and after each aliyah, each portion. But back in the day, they only did one at the very beginning, one at the very end. And it seems that they then moved away from that minhag because they didn't want people to arrive late in shul and think that no one had made a bracha over the Torah, and they didn't want people to leave early and think that people were not saying a bracha at the end of Kriyas HaTorah. So they developed this minhag over time, as we're familiar with it now, where brachot were made before and after each aliyah. It says the Mishnah that you have 3 people called up at these times. Ein pochasin ve'ein mosifin aleihem. You do not call up fewer than 3, and you do not add on to that number. When it comes to midweek, could you imagine the turmoil if we had to give out 15 aliyahs? Could you just imagine? Jeff would be tearing his hair out. Ve'ein maftirin banavi. And also on a Monday and a Thursday and on a Shabbos afternoon, we don't say the Haftarah. We don't conclude with a portion from the prophets. Haposeach v'hachosem b'Torah, the person who opens and the person who closes, meaning the person who gets called up for that first aliyah and says the bracha at the beginning, and the person who seals the reading and concludes the reading and gets called up at the end, Mavarech lefaneha la'achareha. Those are the people who make the bracha before the reading and who make the bracha after the reading. Moving on to Mishnah base. How many call-ups do we give at different times during the year? Says the Mishnah, Roshei Chadashim, on Rosh Chodesh, Uvacholosh Moed, and on the days of Chol Moed, Karin Arba. We call up 4 people. Ein pochasin mehen ve'ein mosifin aleihen. We do not call up fewer, and we do not call up more. And part of the reason, by the way, why we don't call up more than 3 or 4 in this instance is because these are days where people may have other things that they need to run off for. So Rosh Chodesh especially, running off to work, weekdays running off to work, even Chol HaMoed, there may be people who are needing to get away for trips to Legoland and such. So we wouldn't add on. I thought I'd get a smile there, but I didn't. So we don't add on for those aliyot because we don't want to inconvenience the community. Ve'ein maftirin b'navi. At the same time, we also do not do haftarah at those times. Haposeach v'hachosem b'Torah. The person who gets called up first and the person who gets called up last. Mevarech lefaneho la'achareh. They take responsibility for that first bracha and for the last bracha. Zeh haklal. This is the rule, my friends, says the Mishnah. Kol sheyesh bo musaf ve'eino yom tov. Any day where we have musaf, we have a musaf service, but it's not an actual yom tov. Korin arba. We have 4 call-ups. B'yom tov, how many on yom tov? Chamisha, says the Mishnah, we have 5. B'yom HaKippurim, on Yom Kippur, Shisha, we have 6. The Shabbos, Shiva. On Shabbos, we call up 7 people. Ein pochasin mehem, we never go fewer than those numbers. Aval mosifin alehem, but we can add on. Why? Because people are a bit more relaxed. They've got a bit more time on their hands. And so that is why, Howard, you were desperate to ask that question. Well, why do we get 14 aliyot then on bar mitzvahs? Grrr! And the reason is because it's Shabbos, and we can all relax a little bit more. Interestingly, it's not very often that we end up calling more people up on Yom Tov or on Yom Kippur, but it would be permitted fundamentally. It's really only Shabbos that we add on. And in fact, let me just check that the Mishnah isn't explicitly telling us that we only do that on Shabbos. Let's just take a second to check that. What Mishnah is it? Mishnah base.
Yes, but he said you may not take from them, but you can add to them.
Yes, I was just checking that it goes on Yom Kippur and Yom Tov as well. Because the reality is that we don't really do it on Yom Tov and Yom Kippur.
It doesn't say you can do that on Yom Kippur.
It doesn't say.
It says specifically 6.
Oh, it does say. Fine. So then it's only Shabbos that the Mishnah is talking about. So yeah. Okay, we'll leave that for further research. Umaftir and Banavi. And you also say Haftarah on these days. So maybe you can add on these other ones because the Haftarah is clearly talking about Yom Tov and Yom Kippur as well. Haposeach v'achosem b'Torah. Again, the person who gets up called first and the one who gets called up last. Mevarech lefaneho la'achareha. They say the bracha beforehand and they say the bracha after the reading as well. Says the Mishnah, talking in the Mishnah Gimel, which things require a minyan? What do we need a minyan for to be able to do in shul? So it says the Mishnah first off, ein porsin es shema, which it translates on the screen as one does not recite the introductory prayers and blessing of the Shema. What's this talking about? Once upon a time, there would be one person who would recite the brachot before Shema in Shacharis, and everybody would listen. And that's a slightly different model than we have now. The comparison for now is the person who gets called upon to lead Shacharis, to lead the morning service. But back then, they would have had a guy who would stand in his place actually and conduct the service for the brachot leading up to Shema and afterwards.
When you say the bracha, do you mean that the paragraph before we actually say the Shema?
So from Baruch Hu, where we have Yotzeh Or Uvarei Choshech Oseh Shalom Uvarei Sakol, and then the continuation. That's actually, there's two brachot that we say before the Shema. One starts with Yotzeh Or Uvarei Choshech, and finishes with Yotzeh HaMa'oros of Lekel Baruch Nimos Yitenu, and then the second one is Ahava Rabbah.
Oh yeah.
And that so it's interesting. That first bracha starts and finishes with a bracha. It's one whole long thing. And then Ahava Rabbah doesn't start with a bracha, but it finishes with a bracha. And then after Shema, you've got Emes V'Yatziv through to Ga'al Yisrael. And then you've got Ezra Savosenu, which takes us through to Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Be'ezras Yisrael. So that's the two brachas after.
It's nice when that's put to music.
It is. Yeah, we don't really do that midweek though, because we don't want to inconvenience the community. Okay, so there's a few different interpretations of what this Parsin Es Shema is, but one interpretation is that someone would lead from their seat the brachas before. I'm just trying to quickly see if I can remember what the other varieties of interpretations are. I think it's where if the minyan had already kind of gone through Shema, and then you've got one guy who hasn't yet had the chance to catch up, so then he would have an opportunity to say all of these things and still be able to get Shema and Kedusha and Baruch Hu and all of these things. So what we're going to get to a point is that you can't do Parsin Es Shema, whatever the interpretation might be. You can't do that unless you have a minyan. Ve'ein over in Lifnei HaTeva. You cannot lead Chazarat Hashatz, the repetition of the Amida. This is called passing before the ark, and that's because of where the position for the Chazan would, or the Shliach Tzibur would typically be. Ve'ein nosin es kapehen. You cannot do Birkat Kohanim, the Duchenim. Ve'ein korin b'Torah. You can't read from the Torah. Ve'ein maftirin b'Navi, and you can't do the Haftarah. Ve'ein nosin mamad and moshad, and you cannot do the standing up and the sitting down, which refers to a process at the passing of a loved one, at the time of a funeral, time of a levaya. They would stop 7 times and say some words of eulogy, and the mourners would stand up for the eulogy and then sit down again. So you can't do that particular type of process that they used to do. You can't do that without a minyan. Ve'ein omrim birkas avelim, and you don't say the bracha for mourners. The tanchun, which is, what is the bracha of avelim? When they came back from the levaya, and everybody would stand in the street, and then there would be one person who would offer some words of blessing to the mourners. The tanchume avelim, and to be able to do the shura, the row of people that the mourners would walk through, and you'd say hamakom yenachem eschem. So that shouldn't be done without a minyan. Ubirkas chasanim, and the brachas that you say at a wedding.
Is that the Sheva brachas?
Yes, I believe so. Ve'ein mezamnin, it would also be the brachas under the chuppah though. Ve'ein mezamnin, I think. Ve'ein mezamnin b'shem, and you do not, when we have a zimun before benching, so we can say Rabbi Saina Varech if we have 3, but if we have a minyan present, we can say Baruch Elokeinu she'ochalnu mishano v'tefillu chayinu. We can say Elokeinu, we can say God's name at this zimun time. Zimun means invitation, so that's why it says one does not invite others to say benching with the name of Hashem. And you can't do these things pachos me'esara, if you have fewer than 10 men. Uvakarkaos, when it comes to vakarkaos, which is redeeming and consecrating the land, which was required, you had to have people present who could, I guess, testify to the value of the consecration or redemption process. So that required a minyan, but it was Tishav a Kohen. It would need 9 people plus a Kohen to be present for that process. Va'adam, and similarly, if you were assessing the value of a person who had pledged their value to the temple, that assessment had to be made in the minyan. Kayotse bahen, in a similar vein, it had to be done with a minyan present, one of whom had to be a Kohen. Mishnah Daled, going back to the halachas of Kriyas HaTorah. So at the time of the Mishnah, they would read from the Torah, and they would also have a maturgaman. They would have an individual there who would translate the Torah into Aramaic, which was the Francolingua, right? That's the phrase I think I'm looking for. The language of the time. That's what everybody understood. So they would have this translator translating into Aramaic. And there's all different types of halachas with regards to how many verses you could get away with saying before the translator would kick in. So says the Mishnah, Hakore Batorah, if one is reading from the Torah, you're laning, Lo yifchos mishlosh pesukim. You, one second, we need to scroll down. So you should not read fewer than 3 verses. We know that much from Rosh Chodesh. That's why we repeat one of the verses, because in any chunk, when you have an aliyah, when you have a portion of laning, you never read fewer than 3 pesukim. And Lo yikra lematurgaman yoter mipasuk echad. You should not read more than 1 verse without the translator stepping in to translate it, and that was because they didn't want to have a risk of mistranslation. There would be heavy halachic ramifications if, God forbid, the translator was to not accurately translate each and every verse. So they would go 1 verse at a time with regards to laning. Uvanavi shlosha, but when it came to the reading of the Haftarah, there aren't really that, the risk of halachic ramifications, and so you could get away with reading 3 verses from the Haftarah and then have the translator step in. Hayu shalashtan shalosh parshios korin echad echad. If you have got 3 verses, which, if you were to look in the actual scroll of Nevi'im, not everyone realizes this, but we know that our Torah is written on a scroll, but the Nevi'im and the Kesuvim, everything was written on a scroll. We're familiar with Megillah Esther, reading that from a scroll, but actually all 5 Megillahs, especially if you go to communities in Israel, that's all read. They're all read from scrolls. And in some communities in Israel, even the Haftarah is read from scrolls. So if you look in the authentic way in which these Nevi'im, the Haftarahs are written, so you may find that you've got 3 lines, 3 verses, which if you were looking in a Hertz or an art scroll, it's just 1 long paragraph. But perhaps in the actual scroll, it's a broken up paragraph. So if you've got 3 verses, which in the structure of a scroll represent 3 separate paragraphs, then you have to read them one by one. You can't jump paragraphs. Says the Mishnah, Medalgin b'navi ve'ein medalgin b'torah. If you were needing to read from multiple places, which sometimes we do with the Haftarah, we might start in one part of a chapter and then skip to another part of a chapter or to a different chapter. We might start in one place and then have to skip to another. So you could skip while the translator is doing catch-up, as it were, if you were doing the Haftarah, but you can't do that for skipping in the Torah. So if you needed to go to a different point to do the maftir, let's say, you wouldn't be able to have the translator skip and do all of that in one go. How far would the translator be able to skip? Sorry, how far could the reader skip? They can skip as far as he can, provided that the translator will not conclude his translation while the reader is still rolling. So as long as he can do it without making the community wait, then you'd be allowed to skip and change places in the scroll. Moving on to Mishnah Hey, says the Mishnah. See, the Mishnah recognizes that you can jip people with your call-ups. You know how sometimes people get called up for only a small aliyah, and they're like, "Oh, am I not more important than that? I should have been given a longer piece." So the Mishnah recognizes that there may be this kind of sentiment, and says the Mishnah, Hamaftir banavi, one who does the Haftarah, hu pares al Shema, he should be given also the kavod to make the brachot on the Shema that we were alluding to before, be the equivalent of giving the guy who reads the Haftarah, giving him Musaf as well, giving him Shacharis. V'hu over lifnei hateva, and he should also be honored with leading the repetition of the Amida. V'hu noseis kapav, and he should be given the honor of duchening as well. This is a bit strange because all Kohanim can duchen, but what this means is that he can lead the Kohanim in duchening. V'im haya Katan, if the person reading the Haftarah was a minor, was under the age of bar mitzvah. Now we don't really practice this in Ashkenazi synagogues, but certainly in Sephardi synagogues they do. That kids who are under bar mitzvah read the Haftarah. So if it was a minor reading the Haftarah, aviv or rabba ovrin al yado, then that honor should be given to the father or to the teacher to lead the davening or whatever it might be. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Vav, Katan korei b'Torah or metargem. Officially, a minor, a boy under bar mitzvah, can read the Torah and can translate as well, can be appointed as the translator. Interestingly, we don't really practice this nowadays, and certainly by the time of the Rishonim, the early commentators, they say that this would have only been permitted from Revi'i and onwards. For those first important 3 aliyot, you would have required an adult. Interesting to see, though, how the Mishnah at least presents this topic. But so while a minor might be able to read from the Torah and to translate it, they cannot lead the community in these brachos for Shema. They cannot lead the repetition of the Amida. And they cannot lead, and they cannot be the one to duchen as a kohen.
Yes, wouldn't you say that reading from the Torah was really quite important as a minor?
Yes, you would.
And yet you cannot continue to read the Shema or if you're a
you're saying that it would be more important. So,
yes.
So my guess would be, this is all guesswork, that by hearing the first 3 aliyot, you've at least fulfilled the mitzvah of hearing an official Kriyas Torah, reading the Torah. And so they're not necessarily, by reading from Revi and onwards, at a time when this would have been permitted, they would not have been trying to fulfill a mitzvah on the behalf of others. And so the problem is having a person who's not obligated in mitzvahs doing a mitzvah on your behalf. So if they're not doing a mitzvah on your behalf, then they can do it, which is why the Haftarah can be read by a child. It would seem perhaps then, my instinct would say that the first 3 aliyot really have to be done by an adult so that they are discharging the obligation for other adults. And similarly, because adults have the obligation to daven, that is why a katan, a minor, won't be able to lead these parts of davening and fulfill the mitzvah on behalf of others. So even though reading from the Torah is a very important thing, my instincts would say that actually we're not saying that they are fulfilling any part of the obligation for adults with these things. Whereas if you were to ask them to lead the davening, if you were to ask them to repeat the Amida, then you would be expecting a child to fulfill the mitzvah on behalf of an adult, which is not possible. That would be what my instinct tells me. Okay. Pocheach, what if a person has ripped clothing? Pores es shema umetargem, then they can be called upon to lead these brachot because they would be standing in their seats. Umetargem, and they can translate. Aval eino kore b'Torah, but they can't do anything more public and visible than that because they're standing in shul with ripped clothes. It's not respectful to them, and it's not respectful to the environment. So they can't read from the Torah. Ve'eno over lifnei hateva, and they can't be asked to daven and to lead the repetition of the Amida. Ve'eno noseis kapav, and they can't be asked to duchen. What about a summa? What about a blind person? Pores es shema umetargem, so they
hang on. You're now talking about clothing and how you should be clothed in shul.
Right.
I mean, today people come in, dare I say, all sorts of shapes and sizes of clothes, including ripped ones, ripped jeans in particular. It makes this particular sentence rather difficult to interpret in today's standards.
Yes, our standards have changed. Certainly, modern Orthodox communities. You would not get invited to lead the davening if you showed up in Gateshead with a pair of ripped jeans.
What about a tie?
What about a tie?
I mean, when I was a lad, perhaps even I'm a year older than you, you wouldn't dream of going to shul without a tie on.
So
Today,
the accepted practice. I can't say with certainty, but I would imagine as the sugya, as the topic gets discussed in the Gemara and in the sources afterwards, it will be based a lot on prevalent custom. We're talking here about somebody showing up with, tatters. Yeah, that's right. Nowadays, as you say, people come with ripped jeans. Once upon a time, you wouldn't be allowed to lead a service if you were wearing shorts or if you were barefoot. But we know from prevalent practice in Israel that that is not the accepted custom anymore. But if you go to some communities, they'll still be very strict on that. People wearing shorts and people wearing sandals will not be asked to lead services.
Right.
So it all depends on what's the acceptable conduct. So yeah. So a summa, a blind person, Pare says Shema umatargem. So a blind person can lead the brachas of the Shema, and the reason why that's perhaps surprising is because we say in that bracha Yotzeh or Uvorei Choshech Oseh Shalom Uvorei Zakol, and we also say at the end of Lekel Baruch we say Yotzeh Habe'oros. We bless Hashem for creating light and the luminaries, and they can't see them and they can't benefit from them. To which the Gemara, I believe, says even though they don't benefit from the light, they benefit from people who benefit from light, and so that's why it entitles them to still make that bracha, because the people that help them are benefiting from light. So it's still within their capability and within their permission to bless God and to thank God for having provided this illumination. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol shelo ra'a ma'aros mi'amav. He takes a stricter approach, actually. He says anyone that hasn't actually seen the luminaries in his life because he was born blind, eino pares shema, that such a person shouldn't lead that part of the service, because how could they make that bracha if they've never had that benefit? But I don't believe we would. I don't believe we paskin in accordance with that position. Says the Mishnah Zayin, Kohen sheyesh biyadav mumin. If a Kohen, this is definitely going to open up a can of worms, and we're not going to go all into the sugya over here. But a Kohen who has blemishes on his hands, lo yisais kapav, he should not duchen. And that's because if people were to see the blemish, whatever it might look like, it may be dishonorable, or whatever the word is, to the Kohen, to Hashem, for people to be put off in that way. So therefore, the position in the Mishnah is they shouldn't do these things. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af mishahu yadav tsavuos istis ufua. Even if a person's hands were stained, perhaps even from the work that they do, with this translates. It says satis on the screen. I've got it here as like some kind of indigo ink or some kind of red ink. Whatever it is, they've got some kind of stain on their hands. Lo yisais kapav. They also shouldn't duchen mipnei sha'am mistaklim bo, because people are seeing them, and it's not going to be kavadik. It's not going to be respectful. And as I said, that does open up a whole topic which is beyond the remit. Certainly does today. That's right. So for more on this, check out the sugya. Mishnah Ches, says the Mishnah. If a person was to say that they're not going to lead the service because they are wearing coloured garments, they should not be asked to lead, or should not lead the service, even if they were wearing all white garments. Now, the reason for this, I think, historically, is because there were people who denied the authenticity of the Torah or the existence of God, whatever it might be, whatever it is, this would be people who we don't want leading our services. And so there was a whole thing back then that if they were to make this claim that they won't daven wearing coloured clothes, which should fundamentally be fine, but we would be concerned that they are a heretic, and so they shouldn't be leading in that way either. The sandal eini over, I won't lead the service if I'm wearing sandals. Af yachef lo yavo, then they shouldn't even do this if they were barefoot. Ha'oset filasu agula, a person who is wearing tefillin which are round. Sakana ve'ein ba mitzvah. This would be a sakana. This would be a danger to their life, because I believe, I don't really know how this works scientifically, but if they were to accidentally thump their head into a wall, it could be very dangerous for the tefillin to, God forbid, smash through their head. Ve'ein bar mitzvah. And they also don't fulfill the mitzvah if they are wearing tefillin like this. Nasana al mitzvah. If a person is positioned their head tefillin right there on the forehead. So even though we say in the Shema that you have to wear the tefillin bein einechem, that you have to wear the tefillin between your eyes, it doesn't mean literally here on your forehead. We know from halacha that we actually have to position the head tefillin so they're right on the top here, so that they don't go beyond our hairline. So that's why we wear our tefillin right up here rather than over here. It's always awkward when people have got like tefillin which are too big, and you just see them walking around like a unicorn, and like you just never know whether to go over and correct them or not. So actually, it was even back in the day, it was a suspicion that they would be a heretic because they are wearing their tefillin bein einechem. So if you take that literally, if you deny the validity and the authenticity of the oral law, which is where we learn that halacha of wearing them there. So if you denied that, if the person was a heretic, a Karaite, or whatever it might be, so they would wear their tefillin straight there. So if you saw someone like this, you have to be worried that they are a heretic. So nasana al mitzvah or al pas yado, or if they were wearing their arm tefillin on the palm of their hand, because it says al yadecha, that you should wear the tefillin on your hand. So if you saw someone like that, then this is a heretical way of trying to fulfill these mitzvahs. Sipan zahav, if they have coated their tefillin with gold, unasana al beis unkali shelo, or they have put their tefillin on over their sleeves, then harezo derech hachitzonim. This is the way of the outsiders, the people who do not take part in the traditions of Israel. And so we have to be very concerned about these people. Now, you may question this and say, what about nowadays? Well, it's a similar thing. Most people who are wearing their tefillin in the wrong way are usually doing it out of a lack of knowledge rather than a willful denial or contradiction of the way that we do things and the way that we practice. Says the Mishnah test, Ha'omer yivarchucha tovim. If a person was to say in their prayers, may the good bless you, harei zo derech haminas. This is a heretical thing to do because it makes it sound like only good people can bless Hashem, and that's not true. Everyone is able to bless Hashem. What if they say, Al kan tzipor yagiu rachamecha? What if they were to say, your mercy is extended to a bird's nest, making it sound like his mercy is not extended anywhere else? V'al tov yizacher shmecha, and may your name be mentioned with the good. Or they say, modim, modim, we give thanks, we give thanks. They say the word modim twice, where we're concerned that they're trying to acknowledge multiple deities. Meshatkinoto, we have to silence them immediately. If they're leading the prayers, oy vavoy, which always makes me think that you have people sometimes when they say v'ne'emanata l'chayos meisim, which talks about, which you translate as dead animals instead of l'hachayos meisim, which is to revive the dead. So you always got to be careful with how you pronounce words. But anyway, but a person who could be suspected of heretical insertions to their prayers, we have to silence them immediately. If one modifies, it says here, modifies the text of the portion in the Torah dealing with forbidden sexual relations. So machane is a word for, it says it better there, euphemism, a nickname. If God forbid a person requires a get, so the bill of divorce has to have all of their nicknames and all of the ways in which they are referred to, and that's called So you might get, the get calling for Yerachmiel. His Hebrew name is Yerachmiel, but Hamachuna Stephen, Hamachuna Steve, Hamachuna Stevo, whatever it might be. But it's that word Hamachuna, which refers to these euphemisms, refers to these nicknames. So if a person was reading the portion of Arayot, of the forbidden sexual relations, and he was euphemizing, trying to downplay what the Torah was trying to say, then you've got to silence them immediately, because again, they could be diluting or changing or inappropriately translating what the Torah is intending. Ha'omer, one who says, Umizaracha lo titein lahavir lamolech, and you shall not give any of your seed to set them apart as a sacrifice to Molech. Umizarach lo sitein la'abara bara mayusa, and you shall not give any of your seed to impregnate an Aramean woman. Says the Mishnah, Meshatkin oso benazifa, then you should silence them with force. You will silence them with rebuke, as it says there on the screen. What is the story over there? You are uprooting the verse from its intended. So I'm sorry. Okay, so if you were to interpret that this verse, giving your seed over to Molech, talking about sacrificing your child to Avodah Zarah, and you were to translate that as you should not impregnate an Aramean woman or a non-Jew, then you have to silence them with force, because they are changing the meaning of the Torah, making Avodah Zarah basically be okay because of the way it's been mistranslated. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Yud, which is our final Mishnah of Maseches Megillah. Woo woo! Says the Mishnah, Maase Ruvain, when it comes to the story of Reuven and about how he changed the beds, which some people had interpreted as being intimate with one of Yaakov's concubines. So when it comes to that story, Nikra v'lo, you should read it from the Torah, but it should not be translated as well. And that was to avoid people getting the wrong idea about Reuven. We're told, by the way, that Reuven did not sin, but yet when one goes through that story, people often come out with a conclusion that he did. Maaseh Tamar, when it comes to the incident of Tamar, which is where Yehuda ends up having a child with the daughter-in-law that he had planned in the future to give to his third son as a wife. So that incident, Nikra Mitargem, that can be read and it can be translated. Maaseh Egel Harishon, when it comes to the incident of the golden calf, Nikra Mitargem, it can be read and it can be translated. Vahasheni, but the second narrative, which is when Aaron reports to Moshe about what happened, which is later on. Well, it's kind of the same area. But anyway, so that Nikra v'lo mitargem, that can be read, but it should not be translated. Birkas Kohanim, when it comes to the priestly benediction, Maaseh David v'Amnon, the story of David and Amnon, lo nikra'in v'lo mitargemin, they should not be. It says they are read, but in my book it says they're not read.
Interpreted.
Yes, but
not interpreted.
Yes, but that's strange because my book says they should not be read and they should not be.
Mine says are read out, but not.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've got a correction here in this that says that the wording in the Mishnah should be that they are read but not translated. Ein maftirin b'merkava. One should not read the portion, the first chapter of Yechezkel, which talks about the prophecy and the vision of the Merkava, of the chariot, the divine chariot. That should not be read as one of the Haftarahs, although it is, I believe, on first day Shavuot, but there's very deep secrets there. And so according to the first position in the Mishnah, it shouldn't be read in public. Rabbi Yehuda Matir, Rabbi Yehuda says that it is allowed. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein maftirin b'hoda es Yerushalayim. Rabbi Eliezer says you should not read B'hoda es Yerushalayim, make known to Jerusalem her abominations, which I think is the end of that section. He's saying you shouldn't read that part because it speaks derogatively about the Jewish people. Say with me, Nishlama Maseches Megillah, Nishlama Maseches Megillah, Nishlama Maseches Megillah. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing Maseches Megillah. But we're not going to stop there. No, sorry, Bob. We are going to go straight into Moed Katan, into our second chapter of the night, and we'll see if you're up for a third chapter or not. So we're going to dive straight into Moed Katan. Why is it called Moed Katan? Moed is the name of our whole volume that we've been going through, which has been talking about all the festivals. So Moed Katan is referring to Chol HaMoed. It's talking about those intermediate days of a Yom Tov. And it's called Moed Katan because we don't want it to get confused with Moed Gadol, which is the whole Seder that we're dealing with. Yes?
Just before you start Moed Katan, it would appear from what we've just been talking about that there are bits of the Torah and the prophets that were not meant to be read out, yet today we do so.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the line, somebody's changed the rules from the Mishnah.
Yes, that is not unusual.
Oh right. Okay.
That is not unusual. So yeah, different things have evolved in that. Certainly with regards to those halach. I mean, as we said already before, the Mishnah said to us that we only have to wait one bracha at the beginning and one bracha at the end of Torah reading. So that's already one area where the halacha evolved from the simple interpretation of the Mishnah. And now we have brachot at every stage. Okay. Here we go with Moed Katan, chapter 1. So we're going to be talking about the types of malacha, the types of work that one may or may not do during Chol HaMoed. It's a bit unclear as to whether we can do malacha during Chol HaMoed or not, and whether it's biblically forbidden or only rabbinically forbidden. So it's a very broad topic, and there's a lot going on certainly when you get to the practical applications of halacha. But we start in Mishnah Aleph with talking about irrigation, because back in the day that would be of paramount and huge significance. Fundamentally, what we'll see on a number of occasions is that we're not going to be allowed to do things that are extremely strenuous or extremely requiring particular talent or skill. So, but there will be exceptions to that. One exception to that is if you stand to make a great loss from not being able to do something during Chol HaMoed. So that's why we may get to practical applications where certain types of business or certain jobs, certain trades, certain crafts, you cannot do that work over Chol HaMoed unless you were going to make a significant loss. So let's have a look. We're talking about irrigating a field. And we're going to be talking about things that cause a loss of money. And anything that is going to cause a loss of money, you're going to be allowed to do that work to prevent that loss of money. So manual irrigation, it seems, I say this with absolutely no air of knowledge whatsoever, just coming off my notes. Manual irrigation worked by having a trough through the field, and they would direct river water or spring water down the troughs to be able to fertilize their fields. So it says the Mishnah, Mashkin beis hashlachin b'moed uvashvius. You may irrigate a field that is requiring irrigation, that functions through irrigation. You can do that during Chol HaMoed, and you can also do that on Shavuos, when you're not allowed to farm your land. You can still nonetheless keep the field irrigated. Bein mimayan sheyatza betchila, whether it's from a source of water that was starting to flow before Yom Tov, bein mimayan shelo yatza betchila, or from a spring that did not just start over Yom Tov. Did I get that right? Yeah. Whether it started over Yom Tov or whether it started before Yom Tov, you're allowed to irrigate your field. But you're not allowed to irrigate your field with water that has been stored. So rainwater that gets collected in some kind of vat, some kind of cistern, or with mimei hakilon, water that is drawn from a kilon, which is some kind of well or deep pit where you have to draw the water. Because that requires too much exertion, the Mishnah says you can't do that on Chol HaMoed. Ve'ein osin ugios legefanim. And you also cannot dig troughs around vines to be able to get the water over there. So the exertion to be able to do those malachot, to do those forms of labor, they would not be permitted on Chol HaMoed. The word in Hebrew, by the way, is tircha, when it requires too much exertion or too much inconvenience. That's why we also have tircha d'tzibur, inconveniencing the community with long sermons and things like that. That would be called tircha d'tzibur. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah base. It's while it might be the case that digging troughs for Chol HaMoed is too much tircha, too much exertion, it's a machlokes, it's a matter of dispute with regards to Shavias. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, commenting on the Mishnah above, Ein osin esa amma batchila b'moed uva Shavias. You cannot make an amma to start the process of digging these trenches on Chol HaMoed or on Shavias. The Chachamim say, osin esa amma batchila b'Shavias. You can do it during the 7th year, but not therefore during Chol HaMoed. U'mesaknin esa mukukalos b'moed. But you would be allowed to repair damaged water systems on Chol HaMoed, and not only that, but anything that is of public importance and significance is going to be permitted to do, even if it involves tircha. So the Mishnah says, "U'mesaknin esa drachim." You can do roadworks in the public domain. Ve'esar chavos, and you can fix the streets. Ve'es mikvah samayim, and you can fix the bathhouses and the mikvahs, the ritual baths, as it translates there. Ve'osin kol tzarchei harabim, and you can do anything for the public need. Sign in esa kavaros. You can demarcate areas where there are graves to be able to inform people. So if you have graves for whatever reason in public spaces, you can make sure that the plot areas are marked out so that Kohanim know not to walk there, and so that people know that they shouldn't get become impure, become tamei from walking over them. And you can even go out and uproot people's kilayim. If people are growing different plants and vegetables together, which they shouldn't be doing, then you can have people go out and uproot these kilayim to stop people from violating biblical prohibitions. We actually saw a lot of those concepts all the way back in Masechet Shekalim, the first Mishnah of Masechet Shekalim, when they did all of these public expenses on at the beginning of Adar. Says the Mishnah Gimel, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Moshchin es hamayim me'ilan le'ilan. You are allowed to, if there's water collecting under one tree, you can fill a bucket and pour it around another tree. So you can draw water from one and pass it over to another tree to help not neutralize it, not nutrient, but feed it, whatever, or nourish it. As long as you're not watering your entire field, that's too strenuous. If you have zraim, if you have things planted that were not watered before Yom Tov, then lo yashkem b'moed, then you cannot. You are penalized. Then you cannot water them during Chol HaMoed. But the Chachamim do permit watering in these cases. So so you can still do your gardening, I guess. Mishnah Dalet, things which are permitted to prevent monetary loss to your field. And in particular, we're going to be talking about setting traps so that your field does not get harmed by insects and by animals and by rodents. So says the Mishnah, Sadin esa eshus, you can set traps to catch moles, the esa achbarim, and to trap mice. Misteh ha'ilan and misteh ha'lavan. You can do this in orchards with trees, and you can do this in fields of grain. So the Mishnah is saying you can do these in the it says you can do these, but shelo kadarko. But you have to do them with a shinu. You have to do them with a different way. And that is when b'moed uvashvius. That's during Chol HaMoed and in the 7th year. The Chachamim say mistei ha'ilan kadarko. You can set traps in a normal way, using tools and whatever to set these traps. If it is an orchard of trees, and that's because they are susceptible to greater loss, because if you ruin a whole tree, you're ruining loads of produce. Whereas if you ruin the odd stalk of grain here and there, it's easier to manage that. So the Mishnah says, but when it comes to a grain field, then the traps should be set in an unusual fashion. You're allowed to board up a breach in your fences to stop people from trampling on your produce, so you can fix up the breaches. And in the sabbatical year, in the 7th year, you can even build up your wall in the normal way. So even though people are allowed to come and take your produce because it's hefker, it's unowned, you actually can't. You can build it in a regular way because you don't want people to trample your produce. Mishnah Hey, how to have simchas Yom Tov. There is a concept that you have to enjoy your Yom Tov, and so when it would come to a mutzora, to a person who is suspected of having tzoras, the blemish on their skin, so the process would be you would have to go to Kohen. The Kohen would determine whether you have tzoras or not. And then you could be a few different things could happen to you. Number one, if it's not the right color for tzoras, so you're declared pure, the Kohen declares you pure and sends you home. But if it has one of the indications that it's tzoras, so he gets declared tamei immediately and he gets sent out of the city. The other alternative is that he could be locked up in his house for a week and then he gets inspected again. Now the question is though, what if it's Yom Tov? If you start locking him up or sending him out, it's going to ruin his Yom Tov to not be with his family. So that is why the Mishnah says in Mishnah Hey, Rabbi Meir says, that if a guy comes to a Kohen with a suspected patch of tzoras, so the Kohen may rule definitively if it's lenient, if he's going to tell him to go home because he's fine. But if he would be tempted to say that this guy is impure and has to be quarantined or has to be sent out, then actually the Kohen should just remain quiet so as not to ruin the guy's Yom Tov. V'od amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir also says, one second, does it say? So the Chachamim's position, by the way, on that is that actually we just don't go to Kohanim with suspected patches of tzoras so that they don't run the risk of having to be in that situation. So because a Kohen has to issue an accurate ruling, according to the Chachamim, they shouldn't inspect tzoras during Yom Tov because we want to not ruin people's Yom Tovim. Oh, that does say it in the Mishnah. I'm sorry, I missed it. The Chachamim lo lahakel v'lo lahachmir. They shouldn't say leniently and they shouldn't say strictly. They just shouldn't paskin at all because they don't want to ruin people's Yom Tov. The next part of the Mishnah deals with collecting bones which may have been buried following a loved one's passing. And what they used to do was they would bury them wherever they could in a temporary grave, and then they would take these bones to bury them at some point down the line in the official family tomb or the official family burial place. So the question is that a good thing, a happy thing, or a sad occasion? Is it a happy or a sad occasion? So the Mishnah says, furthermore, Rabbi Meir says, a person can gather the bones of his parents to be able to relocate them, because it does have within it a certain element of simcha, that he's going to be happy that his parents are now resting in the official family heritage site. Rabbi Yossi Omer Evel Hilo. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says, no, it is a sad occasion, and because of the avelut, because of the mourning element to this, they should not do that during Chol Moed. Says the Mishnah, Lo Ye'oreh Adam Ameso. A person should not eulogize for their deceased loved ones. V'lo yaspideni kodem l'regel shloshim yom. They shouldn't even eulogize over loved ones for 30 days before a Chag. There's a couple of reasons for this. Some say it's because you may be so impacted from these powerful words of Hesped that it's going to take away and disrupt your Simchas Yom Tov. And the other reason, I really enjoyed reading it, but I can't remember what it was now. The other reason was that, the expenses to be able to hire a eulogizer, to pay the rabbi's speaking fees, because you don't want to leave a person out of pocket before Yom Tov. So you should not pay for these amazing orators who would stir up the emotions at the time of a eulogy. So that would also not be allowed 30 days before a Chag. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Vav, Ein choferin kuchin u'kavaros b'moed. When it comes to preparing graves on Chol HaMoed for people who haven't died yet. So kuchin are these tunnels or coffin-like structures along a wall. So the are crypts, as it says there on the screen. Ein choferin kuchin. You should not dig and prepare crypts, ukavaros, and burial places on a festival in preparation for something down the line. Aval mechanchin es hakuchin b'moed. But you would be able to finish up preparing a crypt, because that's not as much tircha, it's not as much exertion to put the finishing touches to it. Va'osin nivreches b'moed, and you can make these laundry troughs on Chol HaMoed. So even though we'll see later that you shouldn't do laundry during Chol HaMoed, if you are in a situation where you need to do laundry, then you would be allowed to do that. And va'aron im hameis b'chatzer, and you can prepare a coffin from scratch if the dead person is there and needs to be buried. Rabbi Yehuda osa, but Rabbi Yehuda forbids this, ela im kain yeshimon asarim, unless you already have the smooth boards to be able to do it. So if you are literally cutting down a tree, cutting the wood up and preparing it into boards and then putting it together as a coffin, Rabbi Yehuda would say that's too much. You can only do it if you've got at the very least, the pieces of the coffin to nail together. Mishnah Zayin is talking about things which are forbidden because they would disrupt the primary focus of happiness on Yom Tov, of Simchas Yom Tov, even though these things may be Simchas too. So the Mishnah in Mishnah 7 in Mishnah Zayin says, Ein nosin nashim b'moed. You should not get married during Chol HaMoed. Even though it's a Simcha, it will detract from the Simcha of the Yom Tov. Lo basulos v'lo almonos. Not if they're virgins and not if they are widows. V'lo miyabmin. You also should not do yibum, which is where a husband dies, leaving behind no children. They haven't had children. And so the wife, biblically, would have been able to marry one of the other brothers in the family. So you should not do this process of yibum, mipneisha simcha hilo, because in all of these instances, there is an element of simcha that is going to detract from Yom Tov. But if a person divorces his wife and then wants to remarry that wife again, that woman again, then they can reunite during Chol HaMoed because it's not as much of a simcha, because it's not their first time being married. A woman can make her jewelry and can make herself look presentable during Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Yehuda limits this and says, Lo tasud, they shouldn't be able to do face masks. Now this isn't just like mud masks. Back in the day, they would put lime on their skin, which would irritate the skin and remove the hair and leave them with softer skin. They shouldn't do this kind of process, because can you imagine walking around with a thing of lime all over your face? It doesn't look particularly pleasant, and it's not particularly exciting experience, and so they shouldn't do it. I guess the modern equivalent would be waxing and things like that. Mishnah Ches, not saying that you can't wax on Chol HaMoed, I'm just saying perhaps the equivalent would be. Okay, Mishnah Ches. Hahedyot tofer kadarka. So you're not supposed to sew and these types of things on Chol HaMoed if you are particularly finely skilled in this area. So the Mishnah is going to say that it depends on your expertise over here. Hahedyot tofer kadarka. A normal person who's not particularly skilled, they can sew in a normal way. Why? Because even a normal type of sewing is going to result in non-straight lines. But if it's a particularly skilled person, then they have to sew up in a jagged fashion. They can't do it in the best way. And they can also do this interweaving process for tying the ropes around a wooden frame to make a bed base. They'd fill it with straw, with hay for mattresses, so you can construct these wooden frames. And Rabbi Yossi says, Af mamatchin, you can even pull these ropes to make them tighter, although he would say that you can't do that in the first place. So you can't start to make these bed bases, but you can tighten them if you've already got them from before Yom Tov. Mishnah test, let's try and speed this up a bit, folks. We're hitting an hour. Says the Mishnah test, Ma'amidin tanur v'chirayim v'reichayim b'moed. You can set up and attach to the ground an oven, a stove, and a mill on Chol HaMoed. Says the Mishnah though, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein mechabshin eser reichayim b'tchila. You can't clean out a millstone, or it says on the screen here, chisel them for the first time, because that's too tedious, requires too much tircha, too much exertion, and so you can't do that on Chol HaMoed. And then finally, I think, this is our final Mishnah, and it's going to be our final Mishnah for tonight. I have failed you in getting through 3 parakim. I beg your forgiveness. Says the Mishnah, talking about certain fixtures which are permitted because of the danger or because of the loss you may incur. Osin ma'kel agag. You can make a rail around your roof, which is a biblical commandment. V'lamir peses, and around your balcony. Ma'aseh hedyot. If it is done in a way which is called Ma'aseh hedyot. Notice the similarity between the word hedyot and idiot, by the way. But the word literally means a layman, someone who is unskilled. So if you are putting these bricks or these rails down without cement, you can do it. Aval lo ma'aseh uman, but you cannot do it in the way of a craftsman. You cannot get professionally made mirpesets or guardrails. Says the Mishnah, Shafines Sadakim, you can tar your roof, plaster over the cracks. Oh, interesting. Talks about it in the context of an oven over there. But I have it with regards to making a roof and plastering over and tarring over a roof. Umagilin osan b'magila bayad v'regel. You can smooth them over with a hand roller or with a or pressing down hard with something under your feet. Avallo b'machlet sign. But you can't do it with a specifically professionally designed roller built for that purpose. Hatzir, when it comes to hinges, v'hatzinur, or the cylinder of the hinge, v'hakora, or a crossbeam, v'hamanu, or a lock, v'hamafteach shenishbaru, or a key that's broken, masaplim b'moed. These things can be fixed on Chol HaMoed as they are essential and their repairs cannot be delayed. As long as you are not intending ahead of time to do these things on Chol HaMoed and saying, do you know what? I've got a week off next week for Pesach. That's when I'm going to attend to all of my home improvements. We can't do that. V'lo chavashin, and you shouldn't pickle things. You shouldn't preserve food. Shehu yachol le'achol mehen b'moed. No, let's try that one again. V'chol chavashin, anything that you are planning to pickle and preserve, shehu yachol le'achol mehen b'moed, which you are able to eat on Chol HaMoed, then kovshan. You can preserve those things on Chol HaMoed. But if you were pickling them for down the line, then those things would not be allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing chapter 1 of Moed Katan. And that is all for this week. As we say farewell to everyone on YouTube, we wish you a wonderful, meaningful night, and we'll see you again